take you right into something that gets said a lot by non-believers in response to statements made by believers like myself who argue for God's existence. It goes something like this. Okay, so you're saying there's a mind present in and throughout reality, and you call it intelligence or intelligent design. You describe it as a rich reality with ordered complexity throughout. Some of you even call it divine intelligence. You say that this mind and its intelligence supposedly created and sustains the universe. This mind expresses itself in and through reality, but that answer to the complexity of the universe and to reality itself just raises a bigger problem. Because now you've got to explain that mind and how and why it's more complex than the universe itself, and that just makes the problem worse. Well, I have to say, in all honesty, that's not a bad argument against the explanation we give for reality and everything we see in it. In fact, it's probably one of the strongest arguments that gets made against the idea of God and his existence. You hear it all the time, and to be fair, at first glance, it feels like it lands, and that's because it sounds reasonable. Hello, my name's Braden, and you're watching one of the many videos from a series of videos I'm doing for my channel here in 2026. They're found in my playlist called Faith, Reason, and the Search for Truth. You'll find it on my YouTube channel titled Dispelling the Accusatory Fog under my name, Braden. My non-believing friends often say to me, you believers have to explain the complexity of the universe and everything in it by appealing to something even more complex. But science, or the scientist's argument, says we don't have to. They posit the unproven ideas of the Big Bang, where the universe expanded from an extremely small, dense state that was the size of a pea, and abiogenesis, which is the study of how life originated from non-living organic matter through natural processes, to explain what they believe the source of everything in it is. For many, those ideas have a ring of common sense to it, don't they? But here's what I want you to understand about this video I'm doing. Please understand that we're not starting over here. We're testing something. We're taking that argument of theirs and those ideas posited by our non-believing friends seriously. And we're asking a very simple question of them. Our argument says God, Christ, his beloved Son, and the Holy Ghost together are the intelligent mind. And we can posit this because it actually holds up in light of what we've already discovered and come to understand about this incomprehensible mind, this source of all light and truth acting in our lives and our experiences. And if you've been with me through this series and watched all 13 videos that I've done so far, you already know where and what this understanding has pointed us to. But even if you haven't, stay with me here as I lay out for you a few more insights. Let's slow the materialist argument down a bit so we don't misrepresent it. Their idea is this: complex things need explanations, and the best explanations must be simpler than what the complex thing itself is. In other words, that's how science works. You don't explain something complicated by introducing something even more complicated. So, if someone says God and his mind, in other words, the Godhead, explains the universe and all things in it, their response would automatically be, you're now positing something even more complex, God, to explain what's being called mind, that power which rules over the entirety of the universe. So instead of solving the problem, you've multiplied it and made it even more problematic. Okay, let's go ahead and bring this out of theory and into what we're actually dealing with. Reality. Because here's the tension. We're not just talking about complexity in general. We're talking about something very specific: consciousness, awareness, understanding, moral accountability, meaning and truth. This is not just stuff, it's lived experience. So now the question shifts. It's not that God is complex, it's what kind of mind can produce the kind of lived experiences that we all have had while living in this state called reality. Because if what we're trying to explain includes awareness, then we're already dealing with something that's far from simple. Think about what's being asked of you here. You're being told the explanation must be simpler than all of the complex dimensions, these aspects or features of conscience that we all experience every day of our lives, such as awareness, understanding, a sense of meaning, and moral accountability. What they're actually saying is that the answer must be non-thinking, even when we're dealing with information. Conscience and consciousness always include thinking about information, which we all know information comes from a mind. The bottom line here is this mind is God's mind. Let me say it plainly. If I'm trying to explain a rock to you, that's one kind of explanation. If I'm trying to explain the mind, a conscience that possesses awareness, moral accountability, and meaning, each aspect being a complex dimension of a mind, that's something entirely different. You don't explain awareness with something that has no capacity for awareness, right? At some point, the explanation has to be sufficient to account for what's actually there. And there is indeed a whole lot of so called unexplainable somethings there, especially when it comes to explaining information, explaining mind, and explaining reality. This is where everything starts to come into focus, because the explanation being offered by materialists and our non-believer friends, the idea that everything about the human mind can be reduced to purely physical processes, implies we're all unguided chemical misfirings. In other words, a computer brain doesn't just struggle, it fails to explain what we actually experience. Our materialist friends can't seem to explain consciousness, not abstractly, not personally, and especially not experientially. They can't explain why you are aware, why you recognize truth, why you feel accountable, why meaning itself feels real instead of invented. These aspects of our mind aren't side issues or one-offs. These are central to what it means to be human. So now watch what happens. Their argument's rule says, don't explain complexity with something more complex, like filling the gap with God and its omniscient mind, and say that's just how our minds work. But I want you to know that that's not even the real issue here. We're not introducing complexity for no reason. We're responding to what's already here. In other words, reality already includes consciousness, moral awareness, understanding, meaning, and moral accountability. And so the point isn't that the explanation has to be simple. The point lies in the question, what must this explanation actually account for? They being those experiences that take place daily within the reality that you and I and everybody else live in. That's what matters. This is where things get real, because if you go the other direction, if you say there is no mind at the base of reality, just matter, then you run into something that hasn't been solved, not philosophically and not scientifically, and that something is consciousness. Why is there experience at all? Why is there a feeling? That feeling being a feeling of being you. Materialism doesn't just struggle with that, it can't explain it. Now, let's bring it back to yourself. You're not just observing reality as you live in it. You're aware of it. You don't just process information, you understand it. You don't just act, you feel accountable for your actions. So, whatever explanation you come up with for reality, it has to be able to account for you and all of your lived experiences that you've experienced living in it. You can't just chalk it up to matter alone. With that said, let's go back to the original claim. A complex God creates a bigger problem. Here's what we've actually found. This so-called problem was already big, and that's because, as I said, reality already includes consciousness, which consists of aspects like moral awareness, understanding, moral accountability, and meaning itself, which aren't what you'd call simple aspects. So, the question never was, how do we keep the explanation for complexity simple? The question has always been, what actually explains what we experience in the reality you and I actually live in every day? Well, I suggest you consider that it's the grandeur of God and the Godhead. It's the explanation. And yes, it is a rich reality with ordered complexity throughout. You can even call it divine intelligence. I sometimes call it the incomprehensible it. So there you go. We've taken one of the strongest objections and didn't dismiss it. We walked through it, and what we found was this. The problem isn't that the God hypothesis is too big. The problem is that the alternative explanation put forth by scientists is too small. And if that explanation can't account for consciousness, can't account for meaning, can't account for truth, all of which is part of the reality of lived experiences we've each had, then at some point you have to ask yourself whether it's the right explanation at all. And that's where we're going to go in our next video. So until video 15 goes live, I want you to ask yourself this question. If what you experience every day doesn't fit the explanation you've been told your whole life, should you keep trusting that explanation? Anyway, until next time, I wish you continued success in your search for truth, and more importantly, in your willingness to follow it. God bless. Love you. Bye.